I was like a functioning alcoholic in some ways, hiding under the duvet. Went home that evening and, very, very drunk. Sort of 24 hours later, I ended up buying a football club. I needed something in my life at the time to have direction, purpose, prove to myself that I could build something. Maybe I should have bought a kebab. For this to happen and being the biggest upset in FA Cup football history for a little town like ours, I just can't actually believe it still. To see the fans running, jumping up and down, screaming, crying, grown men crying in the stands. There's no question about that club saved my life.
Hello and welcome to Lives Less Ordinary on the BBC World Service YouTube channel. I'm Jo Fidgen. Some of us will have a few stories about dubious decisions that we've made after a few too many beers, but I think Rob Smethurst takes the biscuit. In 2020, he went out on a 4-day drinking binge and bought a football club. Macclesfield Town in the north of England was on its uppers. It had been closed down, run out of money, bit of a wreck, as I think Rob would say that he was at the time as well. 5 years on, what a comeback for both of them. Macclesfield FC have just beaten massive odds to knock out of the FA Cup the cup holders and Premier League side Crystal Palace, 117 places above them in the league. It's been a massive story. Rob, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Shall we start with that 4-day bender you were on? So 4 days of nothing but drinking and sleeping?
Yeah, it was a crazy part of my life. I'd been literally just drinking non-stop. It was a constant waking up in the morning, getting a bottle, drinking, a real tough time of my life.
So what, you'd go to the pub with friends on your own? What were you doing?
Yeah, so I think it was a period of my life. I'd unfortunately just had my marriage had broken down. Decided to buy a house on my own. It was during that time, during sort of COVID, where, I just started drinking. I thought it was acceptable to drink at 12 o'clock. And it just got gradually worse and worse. I was up till 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd be waking up, I'd be carrying on drinking. It was a real sad part of my life.
Drinking at home alone?
Drinking at home, going out, partying, people coming round, endless nights of partying, wrong people in my life. Just kind of really just wasn't me when I look back. But at that time, it felt like it was me, and that was the life that I wanted to live. I'd pushed my family away. The marriage had broken down, and I just wanted to be on my own and bizarrely just almost drink myself into oblivion.
Where were you then when you heard that Macclesfield Town was up for sale?
I'd literally been out for, with a load of mates, and we'd been in a bar, and one of my pals just turned around and said, look, there's a club up for sale on Rightmove. Macclesfield Football Club had gone bankrupt. So I just went home that evening and, very, very drunk, sort of, believe it or not, carried on into the following day, and, sort of 24 hours later, I ended up buying a football club.
Okay.
It was that quick.
So let's talk about that 24 hours for just a moment. So your friend tells you that this club is up for sale on a property buying and selling site, not
Correct, yeah.
Not where you'd normally find a football club.
You wouldn't not normally know.
Why was it there?
I don't know. It was a funny one because everyone says that. It was in the commercial section. I think the company that had repossessed it had marketed it out onto Rightmove for $500,000. And to be fair, my life was in such a mess, I can't actually remember buying it through the whole process.
Okay, but do you remember what made you think you might like to buy it?
I think I'd got to a stage in my life, I'd basically sold my business and, I'd done really, really well. And I just kind of had no direction, no purpose. I was completely lost. I had more money than you could ever imagine. Yet I ended up the opposite of what people probably think when you sell a business. People think it's, it's great, it's fun having all this money. But for me, it had the opposite effect. I would be getting up in the morning with nothing to do. So, what else was there to do? You could go for a dog walk, you could go and watch Netflix, but, in the end, it just became so repetitive that I had no purpose.
So you were looking to buy a purpose, do you think?
100%. Finding a purpose. I needed something in my life at the time to have direction, purpose, and something just to prove to myself that I could build something amazing that could kind of help other people and that's kind of how the journey started.
So why football then? Was football a big part of your life?
No, it wasn't. It was when I look back, it was a laugh. It was a fun thing for me to do when I was drunk. I didn't really think about it. It was just something that I just thought I'd just have a go at. No business plan, no idea really of the past of the football club. Obviously, I knew that it had gone bankrupt, and I knew that a lot of people of my friends who lived in Macclesfield had been supporting that club for a long, long time. But I never really gave it any thought. It was as crazy as buying something. Maybe I should have bought a kebab.
So when you sobered up then, I mean, what did you think of what you'd done?
It was funny, really, because believe it or not, the story it gets even more funny because I ended up getting a telephone call from a guy called Patrick, who was obviously the old club secretary, and out of the blue, and he said, "Look, can you meet me at the football club?" And I'm like, what are you on about? And I got myself out of bed, and we went down to the ground, and I met this guy with a massive bunch of keys, and he just handed them me and walked off. And that was it. And I'm thinking, what have I done? This is the most craziest thing you could possibly do. And I spent about an hour trying to get into the football club, with a massive bunch of keys. It was an old club, trying to get in. No, that didn't work. And then eventually I got myself in. And, when I looked around the football club, it was like, this is just, the whole place the receivers had been in, they'd ripped it apart. There was nothing in there. Anything of any value had gone. And at this point, I sort of stood there in the middle of the ground, just thinking, what has my life come to? Why would you do such a thing like this? And I hadn't even told my wife. And even though we were sort of separated at that time, I asked her if she would come and, have a look at this purchase.
Telling her what it was?
No, I just gave her a location at the time. And that was it. And she turned up and...
What did she say?
I think her face said it all. I think the realisation of probably how crazy I was to buy a football club, probably for her was just for someone that didn't really have any interest in football. I think it was a moment in time maybe where she probably just thought, I finally lost the plot.
We'll come back to that moment a little bit later on, but let's just go back and find out what your life had been like up to this point. You said football wasn't a very big part of your life growing up. What about money? I mean, were you born rich enough to buy a football club?
No, not at all. I've come from nothing. My parents obviously did very well. They were a great family growing up. I lived in a nice house. There was no real issues. Growing up sort of in the early stages was just like any other kid, really. I had a brother. Dad was in the car business. My mum worked. And, we just went to school like everyone else.
And you weren't doing very well there?
No. School for me was probably the worst time of my life. I had ADHD, where my head's all over the place. I'm dyslexic. So to try and put me into, trying to learn maths and English sat in a classroom, you may as well have spoke a foreign language. I didn't understand anything that was going on. And, I was in the bottom set for everything. That for me is, I used to hide in the playground, because I was so ashamed of going into lessons. It didn't matter how hard I tried. I was a real trier, but, when the teacher just writes red marks all over your papers and puts a U and unclassified and pathetic.
Is that what it said? Pathetic?
Very different then. People understand it now. People understand dyslexia and ADHD, but, when we go back to when I was at school, it just wasn't, you were classed as thick. And that was the reality. So I was kind of felt that I was thick, and that I did struggle with it because, I felt, well, am I really thick? And when you're told it so many times, you believe it.
So how did that make you respond? I mean, did you think, okay, well, I'm never going to get anywhere? Or did you think, I'm going to prove everyone wrong?
Yeah, that's my nature is I want to prove people wrong. I want to be successful. I knew that I had to try harder than most people. But I could visualize things that people probably couldn't visualize. And I'm also a risk taker. I like to take risks. I'm not afraid of failure. When I eventually left school, I was so determined to prove the teachers wrong, to prove people wrong, and to prove myself that, I have got ability. I didn't know what that was going to be, but I just believed in myself.
Mm-hmm. You said your dad was in the car business and you get into doing up, selling second-hand cars.
That was right, yeah. So I left school at 16. Again, no education, no nothing, no direction. And my dad said to me, look, you're going to have to try and earn some money. So, you need to go out there and buy cars and follow what I'm going to do. And he did. And he did that for probably 3 or 4 years, which I learned sort of the trade. And then he had a massive heart attack, and shocked us all. Again, that was a moment of a real shock. He went and had a heart bypass, and then he gave up work. And I was kind of then left on my own then to have a go at trying to be successful.
So did you take over his business, or how did it work?
In them days, we're buying cars out of, main dealers. I was bringing them home, I was cleaning them, I was spraying them and then reselling them in the local paper. And that was what I did for probably a good 3 or 4 years from home.
And made money from it?
Yeah, I made money. And then I decided then that, I wanted a pitch. It was always what I wanted, a car garage, which I did. And I spent all my time doing that. And then, 2 years of that, it all went and fell apart. I lost everything. It just didn't work. The overheads were too expensive, and I lost everything that I'd earned.
So what do you do when things go badly wrong?
I think I've got it in my nature to fight. I'm a real fighter. I believe in myself, and I know that I've always been told at the time, you're thick, you're not clever, you're not bright, and that was probably one time in my life where I thought maybe they're right. But for me, it was more about I'm going to be determined, and I'm going to prove to myself and to prove to other people that I can do it. And I kind of carried on
and started again.
Yeah, and I did that probably a couple of times where I built sort of different businesses. I went into shares. I thought I could make quick money through shares. I lost all my money through shares. And then failure became quite a thing, really.
An important thing?
Yeah, a massively important thing. You learn from your mistakes, and I think that's the important thing. If you can't learn from your mistakes, then you've got a problem. But if you can become a better person and learn from the mistakes that you've made, you can move forward.
So how did you make your first million?
I ended up obviously realising there was a huge market in moving cars around the country, and I ended up building an app, which I started to build. With a development team. I knew the market of the car business. I knew that, there was thousands of cars being moved around the country every single day, and it was expensive. So I set my target on that, and that's when the addiction started, because that was when, I was driving all around the country once I'd built this platform, and I was staying in hotels in London and all over the place, and, barely making meetings, and through the drink. I was like a functioning alcoholic in some ways.
Because you had a family by then.
I had a great family at that time.
A wife and 3 boys?
Wife and 3 boys.
3 boys in private school, I think.
Yes. So I was selling cars while trying to build an app.
Okay.
And it was during that time when I was building the app that, I was investing all my money, that I'd made over the last 6 or 7 years into a platform that I believed in. That, to be fair, not many people did. They thought I was crazy. They didn't believe in it, but I did. And I kept pushing and pushing and pushing. But what I didn't realise is the amount of money that I was spending on creating an app was everything that we had. And that's when things started to go badly. I lost pretty much everything, to the point where I had to pull the kids out of school. The people were going to take the house off us. It was one of those sort of horrendous times where I was fighting basically against the people trying to take my house. I had £2.50 left in my bank account. And I left my car at the petrol station and walked home. It was run out of fuel. Couldn't drive it.
And you hadn't got enough money to fill the tank?
I hadn't got any money to fill the tank. I'd lost everything. Yeah, I'd lost all the money apart from the app was live at that point.
Wow, so you walked home?
Walked home.
And you're still with your wife at this point?
I'm still with my wife at this point, yeah.
And you walk in and tell her that, everything's gone? Pretty
much, yeah. Everything is gone. It was what are we going to do? And I luckily, my mum helped at that time. She came and said, look, she started buying my food for me. Suss's parents, who's my wife, her father started to help to pay the mortgage, just to keep us and the 3 children under a roof. At that time, they didn't understand my addiction either. They weren't aware of it. It was all hidden. And that's when things started to again, relapse and just keep drinking again, hiding under the duvet, that kind of horrendousness that, my life was at that time.
When you say hiding under the duvet, do you mean metaphorically?
No, literally hiding under the duvet. It was, I would pretend I was ill. I would pretend that I was poorly. I wasn't feeling well, but really, I had a secret habit of drinking, and, and that was my escape, to escape from what was going on. This is how crazy addiction was. Addiction is something that pushes families away. It destroys people. It hurts people. And all you want to do when you're in addiction is to be by yourself. You're ashamed. You're embarrassed, and you're hurting so many people around you and upsetting so many people that you just want to be alone, and you push people away continuously.
So at this point in your life, you've lost all your assets, but you're still building this app.
Yes.
Which is going to, in one sense, save you.
Yes.
You get an offer for the app of a phenomenal amount of money.
Phenomenal, yeah.
Can you give us a figure or anything close?
In the tens.
The tens of
millions.
Millions. The tens of millions of pounds.
Yes.
I mean, you think that would be a pretty special moment? The
moment was special. It was. I remember once I had just sold, driving down the road, checking my bank account, and waiting for it to hit. And when it hit, it was a moment of, you've done it. Well done. Kind of almost like a proud moment to myself that, if you keep believing in yourself, you can do it. But then very quickly, that feeling started to deteriorate because I felt I had no purpose.
How quickly?
Probably within days.
Days?
Yeah. Days of realising, when you haven't got a purpose to get up in the morning, your alarm clock doesn't need to be switched on. You get up, you think, what am I going to do today? And you have no direction. Yes, you buy the nice cars. I did. Did I buy a nice house? Yes. And I bought watches. You go crazy. But then you soon realise that actually that's not what life is about. For me, it was more about having direction. I felt I'd got no purpose. I ended up, once I sort of split up from my wife, she couldn't handle it anymore. I'd broken her. I'd broken everyone around me. I'd pushed my loved ones away, and I ended up in a house on my own.
And that brings us back to this 4-day drinking binge that you went on when you buy a football club, what was Macclesfield Town. Makes a bit more sense now that you've got $500,000 in your back pocket.
Yes.
That you can just spend in 24 hours
Yes.
on an impulse buy.
Yes.
Okay, and you said you were looking for this missing direction, but what you have bought, in fact, is a club in ruins.
It was. If I can say it saved my life, it did. So I'd hit the lowest point. I'd been drinking God knows how much, and I remember collapsing on the floor, pretty much thinking, that was it. I could feel my heart pounding, and I generally thought I was having a heart attack. I remember screaming out there for help, but obviously there was no one there because I was on my own. I'd pushed everybody that loved me away, and I think it was a moment of realisation that I'm going to die. And I generally thought, this is it. And I remember sitting against the wardrobe, in floods of tears, just thinking, this is it, this is the day, and all I was thinking about was my kids. What have you done to yourself? You've got everything in the world that people would ever dream of, and yet you have nothing. And I remember, even now, God, I look back and, but that was it. I thought I was going to die. And I woke up the following morning, thank God. It was on that day that I thought, this is the day that I changed my life. I realised that at that moment of standing in the middle of the pitch that I needed to sort my life out, because I felt like I had something to do and it gave me that excitement. So I went into recovery, and I worked harder at recovery than I've ever worked in my life to make sure that I saved my life. And I started to completely change my life around and dedicate myself to a football club.
It's, I suppose, a football club, and it's two things, isn't it? It's the building, the team, and it's the fans and the community. And you wanted to rebuild both of those?
The most important thing for me it is about giving back. I've realised how hard it is out there for people and how hard life is. So actually, if I could give something back to a town that I was born in, that was something that I wanted to do. And I went on a mission. I spent an awful lot of money. I spent 4 million doing up the ground, the facilities, putting a 4G pitch in the middle, really to try and make it a massive community, sort of safe place, but also a community where people can go and enjoy, not only just for the football. It's more about, having the bars and the restaurants and a foundation for kids, which I set up. We have 400 kids that play there week in, week out that can't afford to play football. We buy them their boots. Christmas time, we open up for Christmas for people that can't afford to get Christmas dinner. So to me, it's much more about seeing that the people's faces enjoy something that they so lost in Macclesfield Town when it went under.
Let's just go back to the moment when you've got this massive bunch of keys and you're trying to find your way into the buildings that you've just bought. When you managed to get in there, you've explained what you managed to build it into, but what did you find
Within the club?
Yeah.
It was when I bought it, there was nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there. It was a shell. Grass had grown, the place had fallen apart. There was nothing. So I had 8 months to not only redevelop the whole site, but to get a team and to get it ready for the season.
So you're good friends with Robbie Savage,
yes,
who's a former professional footballer at the highest level, Welsh international, good friend of yours.
Yes, he is.
So you call him up and say what?
I just said, Robbie, I've done something crazy. I bought a football club, Macclesfield Football Club. I need your help. That was it. That was it. Literally as that.
What did he say?
Yeah, you can imagine. It's like, what the have you done this? You haven't. And I said, I have. I said, I need your help. And he hung up. So I rang him back and said, come on, there's no need to be like that. Come on, I need you to be a part of this. This could be amazing. We could do something together, as best mates, to go out there and see if we can build something for fun and have enjoyment along the way. And he still said, no, you're crazy. I can't do this. And then, a couple of phone calls backwards and forwards, he agreed, and he turned up. The press all turned up. And I needed him more than ever there because never experienced anything like it, when all the BBC turn up and interviews and, and that's what he does. And, and also his football knowledge was incredible. So, I knew I could do the business side because I was good at that, but I hadn't got any idea on how to run a football club or even remotely pick a player.
The new club you're building, Macclesfield FC, is going to have to start at the beginning again. So in the 9th tier,
yeah,
the bottom
Northwest
tier
Counties,
of
Prem Division
English
it
football.
was.
How do you pitch for new players at that level?
We just recruited. We ended up just putting an advert out, come for a trial. And we got everybody and anybody turning up. The whole facility hadn't been finished at that point. We were still building. We needed a team because we had to start that season or we would miss a whole year. So we spent ages, trying to find players. We brought a head of recruitment in with a bit of experience to help Robbie. And, we pulled a team together, on a minimal budget, people on £25 a week, whatever we could find to make sure that we started that season on time.
You need players, you need fans. So, how did you approach the fans? Because there were lots of horror stories of people coming in, rich people coming in, buying clubs and then taking out of those clubs whatever they can get and not caring about the football. We
didn't do anything. No, we were just concentrating purely on the infrastructure. We did a few sort of funny things, me and Robbie, out there on Facebook. Robbie was in a tractor, digging up the ground, and we did a few things. We then got the manager, Danny Whitaker, who was a club legend, and we just had no idea what or how many fans were going to even come through that door. We knew there was 900 fans or 1,000 fans that would go to Mac Town, and I was just praying that they would turn up.
Right, okay. So you're ready in time for the season, remarkably. That first match then, how were you that morning?
Very nervous, didn't know what to expect, excited. And when we opened the doors, in my amazement, honestly, I have never seen anything like it in my life. Nearly 5,000 fans came through the door. And at that moment then, it was a moment of, wow. I got a standing ovation on the pitch, and I think at that moment in time, it was an incredible, incredible feeling that we'd reborn this football club, given it back to the community, and that everybody backed it and everybody turned up and everybody supported it.
Mm-hmm. How was the match?
Yeah, we did win. And you know what? We carried on through that season and we won the league. That was an incredible story in itself, to come from nothing, to go through that as quick as we could, and to win the league the first time round was incredible.
4 seasons, 3 promotions. It's a bit of a pattern.
It is. Isn't it crazy?
It is crazy. Of course, you put more money into that club than maybe other clubs at that level
Correct.
are playing at. So how do the other teams feel about you?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think, look, I look at it from other clubs. We because of our fan base and because of the business model that I built with the bars, the gyms, the academies, and everything else that I built a really good business model. And the amount of income that generates can go into a first team budget. Certain clubs can only go so far because of their infrastructure, but it's something that other clubs can do.
So you've flown up the leagues. But there have been a couple of major setbacks in recent months. So first one was Robbie Savage left the club and took 3 players with him to another club. Has your friendship survived?
It's different. There's no question about it. We don't talk as much as we used to. Look, we'll always be friends. We've always got each other's backs if we need it. But I've had to move on with a football club and its fan base, and I've had to look after ourselves really. And I know Robbie wanted to go off and do what he wanted to do, which I respect. He wants to try and move up the pyramid system himself. So I would have liked him to have maybe stayed for a few more years on the journey, because it's not ended and it's been super exciting. But I also respect the fact that he's gone and done what he's done. The hard part for me was when the players left, because we only had 2 weeks, really 3 weeks before the season started, and Robbie had obviously left as well. So someone like myself with not really much football knowledge, apart from obviously what I've had to learn by watching Robbie, I had to do something quick. So I've now got the whole town, the whole fan base, everything was just on me. And, any decision that I made that was wrong could have been a disaster. So I appointed John Rooney.
Wayne Rooney's brother?
Wayne Rooney's brother. He was a player for us. He was a great lad. I liked his dedication, and I spoke to him. He's had no experience whatsoever. And I said, look, we're in a position. I want you to manage the team. We need to recruit because we haven't got enough players to even start the season. Join us on this journey and let's see what happens.
Mm. There was another terrible thing happened to the club, which is one of your forwards, Ethan McLeod, after a match was killed in a car accident, only in December.
Yes.
Which, I mean, how did that affect you and the players and everything that the team has come to be?
It destroyed me. It destroyed all of us. We'd been to a game. We had all been there. He died, on the way back from one of the games. 21-year-old young lad, got his whole life ahead of him. The lads were actually in the bus, only probably 100, 200 metres away, and they were in the traffic for 6 hours, not realising that we'd just lost one of our own players. Sorry, I get upset talking about it. So, it was. It's so tragic, and for me, the hardest part was getting the call in the morning from the police, and then realising that I had to let all the players know about what had happened. And for me, that's probably the hardest thing I've ever had to come across. We rang, myself and Rooney, individual players, just to talk to them, and the reactions were heartbreaking. So sad, and so touching that we're all such a close family. Even all the players, believe it or not. I know that other clubs don't have that, but non-league has a special bond between players and fans, and we all felt it. And I find it very, very difficult even today. But we all got together the following day. We all sat in a room. we all sort of almost just in complete silence for hours. I mean, we were there for probably 6 or 7 hours with no one really talking, and we all stayed together for the next few days, just in shock. It was probably the one point in my time where I actually thought the club was finished, because these things shouldn't happen, and it had, and it's still heartbreaking. And honestly, I admire the players and the staff and the support that everybody has given us, but the players especially on how they've managed to deal with this situation, because they've had to almost go straight back into football so quickly after such a tragic loss. There has been no time to sort of think about it. They've had to go back when they've lost their best mate.
Was there a sense from them that they wanted to play for him?
I think for the first few games it had the opposite. I think it was they were exhausted, they were tired, they were so broken. The changing rooms, they were crying. Some of the players were screaming. Some people just didn't want to play football. It has been that bad. And when we obviously get to the main part, which is the Crystal Palace game, it was really during that time where they wanted to do it for him.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that match. All the headlines, but much more than that. I think it brought a great surge of love from football fans everywhere who love the romance of the FA Cup and haven't maybe seen it as much as they like. And here you've got the underdogs extraordinaire taking on the cup holders, Crystal Palace, 117 places above Macclesfield in the leagues. I mean, nobody thought you were going to win, right? Did you think you might win?
Not in a million years. I mean, it's not even remotely possible. I mean, we've got players that are on £50 a week, £100 a week.
Which these guys making a minute?
These guys making seconds. We've got, a right back who's an England international, playing against, someone on £250 a week who trains twice a week, has got a job. We've got plumbers, we've got bricklayers, we've got people, one of the lads even sells candles, it's so far from anything you could ever imagine, that a club like us that we've really proud of and built, to playing Crystal Palace, the title holders, one of the biggest clubs in the Premier League, coming to little old Macclesfield, to play against part-time players. I thought it was going to be a great occasion, and I generally thought, look, if we survive, anything after 8 or 9-0 in my mind, that it was going to, that was generally what I was thinking. It was always in my mind, I was thinking, look, even if they, every time they score, I would end up cheering. We just wanted one goal. One goal would have been nice.
Yeah. You say that the players who'd had such a very difficult time in the run-up had really got themselves together for this match. They wanted this for their teammate.
They 100% wanted this teammate. He was our 12th man, and it gives me goosebumps thinking about it, because they were incredible. They were fighting, they were running through the thirds. They were so strong. They were. It was for him. It was like something special. It was a moment for them. It was a moment for Ethan's family to be there to celebrate with us. And when we scored, the place erupted. The whole. If we had a roof, it would have blown off.
So, when was the moment then that you thought we might actually win this?
Probably like the last few seconds. It was. We'd scored one, and then just before half time, we then scored again, which was like, okay, this is just crazy. Then they brought the big guns on. And I thought, we've got no chance here. This is not going to happen. And they scored one back. And I thought, this is them now. They're going to just suddenly just change gear and destroy us. And it went into extra time, and I'm thinking, I can't breathe. I generally can't breathe. I can't actually believe what's happening or what I'm even seeing out there. To see how the players just never stop running, and for the last sort of 2 minutes, I thought, oh my God, this could happen. And when it did, and the final whistle went, I was the first on the pitch. Even though they'd warned a million times on the tannoy that no one should enter the pitch, I couldn't hold my excitement.
Did the police escort you off?
Pretty much, yeah.
But, I mean, fans' hero. You must be the fans' hero at this point, as well as the players, of course. But you made it happen.
I did, and I think that's the reality. I did make this happen. I don't know how sometimes, but I don't know what I've done. But for this to happen and being the biggest upset in FA Cup football history for a little town like ours and the amazing fan base we've got, I just can't actually believe it still.
How did you celebrate that night?
I was absolutely jumping up and down, and you can imagine crazy scenes. We all ended up in the bar, everyone dancing, the music was flying, everyone was super excited. We'd allowed all the fans to come into the bar afterwards. You couldn't move. It was absolutely unbelievable scenes.
Was it a free party?
It turned into a free party. I opened the bar up. The lads were pouring pints behind the bars. They were celebrating, and I went home. I went home with my family, and I let them celebrate, and that's what I did, because you've got to take yourself out of those environments. And I sat with my family and we had a Chinese and I went to bed.
With a smile on your face?
With a smile on my face. I think we broke the internet over the sort of 2 days after. The fans have been incredible. I think the captain's had some boots made for him. It's been amazing, but it's not just amazing for me. It's amazing for the fans that have supported me through this journey, and everybody that supported me through my addiction. It means so much going back on my life, really, on everybody that's had my back. And to see the fans, that was my number one thing for me, is the people running, jumping up and down, screaming, crying, grown men crying in the stands.
Did you cry?
I didn't know. I think I was more proud of everybody that had come on this journey with me, to see the staff jumping up and down. They work so hard. And then it also goes out into the town. The town of Macclesfield gets recognition. It's those moments for me that have been probably the pinnacle of my life so far.
Because, it's been a journey for Macclesfield. It's been a journey for you. In a way, you've both the club and you kind of had a second chance, huh?
100%. There's no question about that club saved my life.
Did it save your marriage?
It did. After recovery, it did. Not easy, not going to lie. Sometimes you can break a piece of glass and sometimes it can never be fixed.
But you have managed to put this back together?
Yes, we're working on it.
When you look back at who you were, maybe early days as an entrepreneur, and who you are now, beyond the addiction and overcoming that, do you think this whole journey you've been on has changed you in other ways too?
So many ways. Makes you realise, life is short. It does, because of what happened to Ethan. And, I want to live every day to the maximum. I want to enjoy myself. I want to enjoy family. And I think that's the most important thing, is understanding that your family needs to come first, and enjoy those moments, because you never know what's going to happen. And
would you describe yourself as a football fan now?
100%. 100% I am.
Rob, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching Lives Less Ordinary. Do please subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel, and that way you will never miss an episode. See you next time.